you see the postures of the four characters in that scene, and they're all leaned forward. They're all doing that. I think you certainly want the audience to do it too. First challenge was we have an older cast. Nobody likes doing night. So now we have an episode that's all taking place over the course of a night. How do we light this space? How do we look out the windows and not have night? So we moved it into that living room. And then we had all these wonderful windows to push moonlight through, but you couldn't look out them because it wasn't really night. And I think we decided to sort of add the rain to give us some texture out those windows, but also to sort of tie in the theme of water throughout the episode.
Hi, I'm Jamie Hitchings of Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their skill set. You can learn more on filmmakeru.com. And don't forget to like or subscribe and comment on our YouTube channel. Every week, we interview a film professional, and this week we are joined by Ben Semanoff, whose works include The Old Man, Yellowjackets, Tulsa King, and Ozark. Thank you for being with us today, Ben. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
I want to jump right into The Old Man. And what was interesting about this particular episode for me is that it wasn't heavy in action, but it had a lot of emotional depth. And how did you balance kind of the emotional depth of this episode with kind of the typical um heavier action episodes?
I don't know that there was much in the way of balancing because there was almost no action whatsoever. I think we had one very small stunt sequence where somebody gets thrown down a flight of stairs. Um, and so, yeah, the question is, how do you balance it? Well, there's nothing to balance it with. So instead, I think what we did, working with my team, and in particular my cinematographer Jules, who was fantastic, was we took the opportunity to look at this as a bottle episode and to sort of play with the aesthetic a little bit. I think what may have substituted a bit for the typical action that you'd find in an episode of The Old Man could be a little bit more of the dark horror tropes that we sort of leaned into a little bit. I think thematically, the episode deals with a lot of uh, depth in terms of saying goodbye to loved ones, or maybe not having the chance to say goodbye to loved ones. There's a lot of play with the ghosts of their past. And so with all of those things in mind, leaning into that horror, into the sort of the darkness of the episode, the rain, that was the balance for the lack of action.
I will have to say the episode includes some off-screen violence, some off-screen action, so to say, on the cell phone, and then later in the episode, just off-screen. Um, can you explain a little bit about your intention of not showing more of those action or violent sequences?
Yeah, and certainly that was also a choice that was in the writing. Jonathan Steinberg, terrific showrunner and writer, is pretty particular in terms of outlining what's on screen. I think most interesting for me is the fact that in the scene where you have Harper and Chase, and Cheryl and Zoe in a dark room around a cell phone talking to Emily, Angela, whatever name we want to go by at the time. I think what's really interesting about that is the idea that it really roots us in the perspective of these four people and their helplessness to do anything, or say anything that could solve the issue at hand, which is that she's in a pretty precarious situation, and the Hamzad compound's getting raided. And so I think that's really interesting. I think it really puts us in a real perspective of a parent, and as most parents uh, realize pretty early on, you can try and protect, but for the most part, you're helpless to completely protect your child. So I think that was a really interesting choice, and I think in general, between that and the scene, I think that comes later when Chase is about to torture the prisoner, and then even later at the end of the film, at the end of the episode, when Harold's going to go and clean up the mess. I mean, I think personally, it's interesting the choices of what you play on screen versus off screen are interesting in the sense that it activates the audience. It makes them do a little bit of the work. And so you go from being sort of a sunk in your couch non-participant when you're watching a show that shows you everything to somebody that's leaned forward and fully engaged and curious about what's happening just off to the side of the frame that I can't quite see. And I think our imaginations can be a little bit more gruesome than reality. So I think that's a really nice feature of not showing at all.
It's kind of like the Rosemary's Baby effect. You just
Exactly.
My friends and I would make little videos in our backyards, you know, imitations of Indiana Jones and Star Wars. And, you know, eventually that need to tell stories became more of a technical interest and an interest in the art. To me, what's exciting is using cinema in its full potential, which is rhythm and sound design and music. Our job is to set up expectations and then deliver on them. I'm Brian Cates, and this is my course in film editing.
I felt that the lighting in the cell phone scene, I was engaged in what was going on when I was watching it, you know, as far as the dialogue goes, but I wanted to see more and I couldn't see more. So I was extremely engaged as the viewer during that scene. I thought it was a very um clever way, and it was lit that way for a reason, but it was a very clever way not to show. So I really had to, like you said, actively participate, actively try to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that. I think you know, you see the postures of the four characters in that scene and they're all leaned forward. They're all doing that, right? So you certainly I think you certainly want the audience to do it too. And it was challenging because there were so many challenges. The first challenge was we have an older cast and nobody likes doing nights. So of course an older cast doesn't want to work nights either. So now we have an episode that's essentially all taking place over the course of a night. Um, and so there were challenges in the sense of how do we how do we how do we light this space? How do we look out the windows um, and not have night, right? How do we cheat it? Originally, that scene was scripted to take place in a much smaller room. That was a very dark wood room with almost no windows. And so we felt like that would have been even darker and harder to light and harder to justify where light was coming from. So we moved it into that living room. And then we had all these wonderful windows to push moonlight through, but you couldn't look out them because it wasn't really night. So then came, you know, a whole debate about how can we achieve that? And I think we decided to sort of add the rain in part for that reason, to give us some texture out those windows, but also to sort of tie in the theme of water throughout the episode. And then it was a question of, okay, well, what else is lighting them? You know, do they have lanterns? There wasn't one lantern or scene, but for me, what I was really hoping for and what Jules was able to really execute beautifully was that the phone itself was the principal source of light and was drawing everybody in just like you were describing. You were leaning forward and they are leaning forward and that light is illuminating them, and when that phone gets passed around it illuminates them, and it, you know, and of course it being on speakerphone, the light was being motivated from below, so it even helped us lean into that horror trope even a little bit more. So it was really great. It's really beautiful.
Can you you mentioned the rain, and the rain isn't the only use of water in the episode. Can you mention a little, or can you talk a little bit about the use of water in the episode?
Early on in the script, it was the water principally just played in the basement. The water heater was going to be leaking, and then eventually it was going to be solved. And each step of the way, I sort of pushed a little bit more and more on that thematic of water because I love the metaphor that John was utilizing there, which was that Harper comes home to his house, a place where he typically had sheltered his family from the secrets of his life as an FBI director. and of course of his prior life as a CIA agent. And now there were cracks in that, and the water was starting to leak. The water being the metaphor for the secrets or his secret life, and it was starting to invade his home. And I thought it was really beautiful. And but as somebody that's dealt with water leaks myself at home, you know that it's pervasive. Water just comes from everywhere, and when you plug one leak, five others appear. And so I thought, let's play with that. Let's try and create a fabric here, that ties these secrets that are sort of poking into his home life into everything else that's happening everywhere else in the world of the old man. And there was actually one shot that I think got cut, which was the episode actually started on somebody in the Hamzat family filling up a pitcher of water, and we cut that, but ultimately that pitcher gets used later as they're bathing, as they're washing Hamzat. So the idea was from the first frame of the episode to tie in this water, to tie it in as a connection between Afghanistan and the Harper house, and to tie it in terms of the connection between all of these characters. And then we wanted to play with the water more in the basement. And I thought, well, if that water's been leaking and Charles been waiting for hours, that basement would be getting flooded. And I remember when I brought this up, they had already built the basement set prior to my arrival. And I said, well, we're going to flood the basement, right? And everybody's like, you could see everybody's like just heart sank, because there was no intention whatsoever to flood that basement. It wasn't built that way. And so I think we probably had 15 different subsequent meetings to discuss how we were going to flood this basement. And I kept pushing a little bit more and more and more. But the payoff at the end was unexpected. I wish I could say that I had thought ahead to this idea that if we flood the basement and we see Howard Harper go into the basement and disappear, that we would get this little glimmer of him pulling a saw. I mean, I wish I could say that was the intention, but it was purely a happy accident.
So let me ask you a little bit about Jeff Bridges and John Lithgow. They have similar trajectories, and they're experiencing this grief in this episode without giving away too much.
Mm-hmm.
And they experience this grief, or they act upon this grief in different ways. Can you talk a little bit how you directed them differently to kind of portray their grief?
Sure. I mean, I think in general, Harold wears his emotions on his sleeve a little bit more, and I think Dan Chase, which is Jeff Bridges' character, I think Dan is way more bottled up, and I think that stems from their characters in general. I think Harper played in the past, in their past lives together. Harper played the CIA agent back in Langley, the person that was processing information and then dispensing, whatever sort of amount of resources to Dan that was necessary. He wasn't a field operative. And I think for that matter, he was able to be a little bit more emotional. Whereas I think Dan Chase's character, a field operative, has to hold it together. And I think that's really interesting in this episode, to see these two amazing actors play those two roles. Dan trying to keep it together, keep focused on what the mission is up until the point they get this phone call, and what the mission will be afterwards. And we only get this little glimmer of emotion from Jeff, from Dan Chase, and it's an explosion, and then it's immediately bottled up. It's this moment that he really lets his emotions show to Zoe in the basement. And then and it was a really interesting note. I think I gave Jeff at the end of the scene where they get the phone call from Emily. So he's just basically heard what he believes is daughter and the entire Hamzat family being massacred. And he's really, in early takes, he's really getting quite emotional at that point. And like I just described, I think he's somebody that can contain a lot of that. And I was looking for ways to explain that to him. And I think what I said to him was, you're about to go downstairs and fix a water heater. And that's Dan Chase, right? And it really, I think it tied it all together for him. And he played that beautifully. You know, the end of that scene where you have Harold going, you know, you can see it in his eyes. Oh no, our daughter's dead. And Dan standing up and walking out of the room is an interesting contrast between these two characters.
Curious about creating high-quality YouTube videos? Enroll in video editing and production classes at Manhattan Edit Workshop to sharpen your skills and turn a hobby into a career. Start your journey to becoming a pro today.
So you mentioned multiple takes. Can you talk a little bit about how much time did you spend with the editor and how much time were you involved in editorial?
In television, you get historically you get 4 days in post. It's a pretty short time frame to move mountains if that's your goal. Things are changing in the television world. Directors are now going to get 6 days, which is luxurious. And so to some extent, you're praying for a really terrific editor, which I had. Curtis Thurber was a terrific editor. You try, you know, I try, at least not you try, but I try to communicate with them ahead of time as much as possible, especially if I have a really specific idea for something that I might not think is coming across in the footage that I'm sending them. And so I try to send emails and have phone calls and talk about footage, talk about if there was anything that they were having trouble with, so that in the short shooting schedule we have, I could maybe pivot and correct before the end of the schedule. But having a lot of conversations ahead of time helps, so that when you get into the edit suite with them for 4 days, you can really focus maybe on the nuance and not necessarily on moving mountains.
Like that, the nuance, not moving mountains. That's a great way to put it. Maybe with the 6 days, you can move mountains.
Yeah, maybe. I have lots of ideas, and I always feel like when I start with a new editor that I'm gonna give them a heart attack, because I'll watch the first cut and then I'll type up on an Excel spreadsheet all my notes, and I'll shoot my notes to them, and it'll be like 150 notes, and I'll get these sort of long pauses when they're trying to tell me that it's going to take a lot longer than we have to address the notes. And I go, oh no, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. And most of the time, I think once we get into a groove, they sort of get the sense of what I'm looking for anyway. And those 150 notes maybe don't seem as difficult maybe as they seem initially when they get this giant spreadsheet. But
Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges you've faced in your career, and possibly how you've worked around those challenges or overcame them?
I think the filmmaking essentially is that filmmaking is all about these challenges, regardless how big or small, and navigating around them. Because if we were creating an assembly line to pump out some product that we were going to pump out 10,000 or 100,000 times, we could solve all those little problems, and then from that point on, that product's going to get pumped out. But we're basically a moving factory that's creating one-offs and then moving to the next location, creating one-offs. So there are a zillion problems, and so I think inherently, as a filmmaker, whether I'm addressing a problem in my career, or a problem in my life, or a problem on set, that's just sort of baked into what I do. What are some of the big ones I've dealt with? Probably the biggest challenge is, or was, from a career standpoint, getting an opportunity to direct at this level. And at some point, I started to get the sense that that was the direction I wanted to drive my career. I was a camera operator for about 20 years, and when I did finally sort of set my sights on directing, I had to figure out a way to convince somebody to let me direct a 6, 7, 8, 10, $15 million episode of television. And that was probably the biggest challenge that I had to face. And so I thought the only way that I could make that case would be to leverage my value, become a really good operator, and be invaluable to productions, and then eventually ask the production if they would let me, in exchange for my commitment to the show for another season, if they would let me direct an episode of TV. And it didn't work twice. I tried twice on shows, and it did not work. And I was really dedicated to this idea of directing. So I made sure that people knew I was serious, and I would say, "Hey, I'm happy to come back for a subsequent season of this television show. Would you let me direct an episode of TV on this television show?" And if they said no, I would say thank you. Then I'm going to have to go find some other production to work on. And and they said, "Oh wow, this guy's really he's really committed to this." So I did it twice, didn't work out, and I was fortunate enough for the third time to work out. And that was probably the biggest challenge, especially because, I'm sure nobody was thrilled that I was sort of walking away from jobs, and I'm sure I wasn't doing my operating career a service by doing that. And so it was a risky move, I think, to do that, but it definitely paid off. It yielded benefits.
Yeah, I mean, walking away from a job that you have that takes some chutzpah for sure. So you really believed in your trajectory and what you wanted to do.
My wife did.
That's good. That's
There
good.
was
It's important to have a cheerleader, right?
100%. And that's, honestly, that's a really interesting word, because like that's oftentimes what I am on set, is a big cheerleader for both the performers and for the crew. But the film industry is a hard, long road. And it's feast or famine. And there was plenty of times, especially when we were starting a family, that I was a camera operator at the time, that I was ready to sort of hang it up and look for some other career that maybe was a little bit more stable. And my wife would just say, "Who's going to hire you to do anything else? This is all you know how to do." And I go, "All right, you're right." And I sort of like pull myself back up out of whatever slump I was in, and I would just get back to it. And thank God she was there to do that. So,
That's fantastic. Cheerleader, but a little tough love too.
oh yeah.
That's fantastic. I'd like to know what your guilty pleasure film or television show. It can be something new or old, maybe something that you return to, or you can recite every word. Like, what is it? What is it that you love?
Oh man, that's a tough question because I love so much. But when you use the word guilty pleasure, I think to me that evokes something that you feel guilty for watching. Um, and I would have to say, Vampire Diaries is my guilty pleasure. During the pandemic, we as a family sat and watched every episode of that series. And yeah, so that's my guilty pleasure.
Hey, nothing to be ashamed of at
No,
all.
it's great. It's good popcorn kind of television. And look, I spend my entire career for the most part in really dark places in terms of the content. And so it's fun to sort of like have something light to consume.
Exactly. I think there's a good juxtaposition there for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being with us this week, Ben. I really appreciate it. You can check us out at filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram and at filmmaker_u. I'm Jamie Hitchings, and thanks for watching, and thanks to you, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.